Hi, my name is BLEECKER. I'm coming to you from the Near Future Laboratory, my studio here in Venice Beach, California, to welcome you to the HyperIsland Vision Week. What I want to do is introduce a bit of what we've planned for your activities, as well as some background on design fiction. That's the approach and methodology for doing vision, creative innovation, and futures design and strategy work that developed here at Near Future Laboratory. I actually wrote a book on the topic called The Manual of Design Fiction. So what I'll do now is tell you a bit about myself, then give you a bit of a design fiction 101 to introduce the concepts that you'll be at your disposal during the Vision Week. And then I'll describe to you the design brief that we've put together for your activities, which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. So just a little bit of background about me, just to give you some context. So I got a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, and when I was doing that, I really wanted to use engineering as a way to basically invent futures. And I found that the connection between the future and engineering seemed quite obvious to me when I was pursuing that degree. And so I decided to continue that by getting a master's degree in engineering, this time focused more on the human-computer interface. I was very much interested in the ways in which technology informs, shapes, and kind of gives people a sense of what they can do with the machine, in this case, the computer. And then I went on to get this crazy PhD in a program called History of Consciousness, which allowed me to do a little bit more of a deep dive into our kind of historical relationship to machines and computation and algorithms. And doing that degree kind of really set me on a path to trying to understand and create not just the devices as an engineer might, but also with the kind of mindset of someone who's very much interested in the relationship of technology to our ideas and to the kinds of worlds that we actually create. And so this kind of brought in this idea of world building, which is very much integral to what design fiction is. So as a practitioner over the last couple of decades, I've had the great opportunity to work with very many different kinds of organizations, from nonprofits and NGOs to the kind of usual list of large commercial organizations like Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple I've worked with. I spent about 7 years working in an advanced design team at Nokia. And through all these experiences, I realized that what I was trying to do was connect imagination to the practices of actually making things, of design and engineering. And through these experiences, to varying degrees of success, I've been able to evolve and develop this idea that I then came to call design fiction. So as part of the practice, there's a lot of work that goes on internally, but also a lot of public engagement, I guess you would call it. And the Near Future Laboratory podcast is one of those areas where I have a great opportunity to talk to very many interesting people who are, in one form or another, involved in the same activity of trying to find ways in which we can imagine into more habitable futures. And this has become a great platform for having those conversations and allowing those conversations to circulate within the larger world. I also end up doing things like being like a talking head in different kinds of shows. This one was actually quite fun. It was a little bit silly, but also very much fun to just kind of ruminate on what different emerging technologies would have as an impact on different aspects of social life. So in the case of some of the conversations I had during the show, I was thinking about what is the future of Hollywood? What is the future of entertainment in the context of AI, which is kind of emerging everywhere, and everyone's kind of trying to figure out what it is and how it's going to impact things. So it's just kind of a lighthearted way of exploring that. And I enjoy doing those kinds of things because I think the engagement of new emerging technologies has to circulate much broader than just the people who are implementing it or the people who are funding it. And I think these kinds of shows give a great chance for doing that. So let's get to it. So imagination and innovation. These are two key themes within the work and practice that I enjoy trying to figure out, how do we connect these things? How do we connect imagination and innovation? One of the ways I start thinking about this is to think that imagination is the thing that precedes innovation. You don't just have innovation out of thin air, but you actually have the ways in which humans are able to make sense of things that don't exist yet. And that can be the future, it can be new ideas, it can be an effort to try to represent an idea that doesn't quite have language for it. But this all comes from the human imagination, our ability to dream into possibilities that don't exist, which I find an absolutely fascinating ability and something that I think is generally sort of vaguely understood, but it doesn't feel like it's actually employed or actually put to work in the kinds of ways that I feel like it could, especially in the context in which I enjoy working, which is like, how do we create more habitable worlds? How do we world build into contexts that are not yet fully formed? How do we come up with new futures, new dreams that we can then begin to build towards? So one of the examples I think about in this context is luggage. So luggage didn't always have wheels, which I find absolutely fascinating. So there was a time when the representation of what luggage was sort of looked like this advertising image where it has a sense of like kind of carefree, gravity-free weightlessness. And I just traveled the other day, and it's not that at all, even when you do have wheels. So when you have this world in which no one is really looking at luggage and imagining a world in which luggage has wheels, it's all these other things. And even when they get close, the luggage is in something that has wheels, like a car trunk. It still doesn't occur to them to put wheels on it in this way. Now, I'm not saying that at that particular moment in which the vision of what luggage was couldn't be imagined beyond square pieces of heavy, bulky containers for our stuff. It's just that no one imagined it in such a way as to make that thing possible, to build the infrastructure around the vision of having wheels on luggage just escaped the imagination to a certain degree, or there are infrastructural or structural challenges that made it seem not even worth considering. Including the fact that, well, we've already got this luggage thing figured out. Why should we mess with a good thing? And there can be very many good reasons for messing with a good thing, including improving them in ways that are that we might struggle to dream into it, to imagine. And so it's kind of a miracle that even in 1991, one of the earliest patents for luggage with wheels appears. So 1991 was not that long ago. I mean, the wheel was invented 5 million years ago or something. And yet still the wheel does not make it as an attachment to the luggage in any kind of meaningful way. And even in the way represented here, it's not quite right. If you ever had a piece of luggage of this form factor, there are a few things missing. One of the things are 2 more wheels, for example, and all the kind of mechanical issues that might be associated with luggage that might be slightly unstable in this format, and those kinds of things. So it takes work. You have to really work at imagining the things that, for example, today we take for granted. Like, this looks like they didn't know what they're doing. And to a certain degree, they didn't, but they were exploring, experimenting, and trying to imagine into a world that felt transformative, that felt like a different world. And then, of course, once you get the wheels on luggage, people start doing all the things that they want to try to do when they finally have wheels on luggage, including these kinds of things, sort of luggage that has an electric motor in it that you can actually ride, which seems, I don't know, not quite super practical, but nevertheless, companies get venture funding to create these kinds of things. Like, okay. Or other kinds of things like the luggage that's a scooter. So you really start, once you get the wheel on the luggage, all kinds of interesting opportunities present themselves that people want to continue to explore. It's like all of a sudden there's this great unlock into this particular world. And then, of course, there's the kind of retro aesthetic that people still want to carry their luggage, despite the fact that it has wheels on, which to me is also fascinating. You have these kind of trajectories where the new, at some level, is reacted to by a generation that says, well, we want to represent the alternative, something other than what you expect. We want to push into a different way of living, a different form of expressing our own visions and dreams, or just the typical thing that any teenager will do is to resist that which is expected of them. And I find these kinds of transformations really fascinating as well from a cultural perspective. Vision is also required for innovation. So you need to be able to have that kind of ability to sense into that which does not yet exist and try to represent it. So one of my favorite examples is jogging, which didn't always used to be a thing. Like jogging had to be invented. It had to be, you had to create a vision of what it was, including, in this case, one of the founders of Nike named William Bowerman, believed in jogging, as you might expect for someone who's going to end up founding this enormous sneaker company on the basis of jogging as an activity that should be performed, that has value to it, and so has to write a book. And this book is basically just a didactic explanation about what jogging was. Imagine a world when that wasn't a word, when no one knew what it was. When you said, "Do you want to go jogging?" someone would just look at you. I don't know what that is. So this idea of creating that, of having the vision, enough of a vision to actually create something as simple as a book about this thing at a time when that might have been looked down upon. It might have been like, why would anyone want to run? That just seems like only, a small niche group of track and field athletes do it, or, bank robbers need to run. And that's it. So this, I find an exceptional artifact representing that kind of vision that leads someone to innovate and create something new. And it's to be really sort of straightforward about it. It's just saying, like, what is the goal and the insight around this, and how is it good for me? So, goal, it's like it can be done alone or in groups. It's fun, just simple thing. It's nothing more explainable than that. It's good for the heart and lungs. And you begin to wonder at that point in time, it's like, what were people's understanding about what would be good for the heart and lungs? These are the organs which may determine your lifespan. So you're getting really to the heart of matter. It's a beautiful, simple way of representing the value of something that for which people have not been born into a world in which an understanding of its value is widespread, if it exists at all. And then you have to show it. So this is a book at a time when having photographs in it was a big deal. And this book is filled with them. Just images giving people an idea of, like, this is what it looks like. And you can even notice that, the shoes they're running, like, these are terrible shoes for running. We understand now they're like no arch support, flat sole. I don't know about having, the kind of ankle support, but it's the shoes that were available. They were not yet jogging shoes. You ran in whatever you had, including what you're wearing. And I mean, look at this. There's two women jogging, protect themselves from the rain. They have these rain slickers on that just look like they're just going to get so hot and sweaty in them. But there they are doing it. You also need audacity. It's a key ingredient for innovation. Being able to do the thing that other people do not expect or even dismiss. So this is Dick Fosbury during I think it was the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, doing something that no one else had done, which is to jump over the high bar backwards. Now this is the normal way, but back in the day they used a scissor jump, so they would jump forwards and kind of try to get their legs over it. And of course, it just changed the sport completely. We just saw the Olympics now. It's like no one was going over forwards. Why would they do that? You don't get all the kinematics of the body and the way the body works and how it can get higher and all these kinds of things. But Dick Fosbury looked at this and said, I'm going to try this. I'm going to go over this way. And I just love to imagine, like, when he's developing this technique, that he's just kind of like, hey, this is it, fellas. And everyone else is like, man, don't do that. Doesn't look right. It looks weird. It'll never work, and he does it and completely changes the sport. And from the historical records that you read about and the videos you can see on YouTube, changed everything. I mean, the crowd went crazy. They just loved him. They fell in love with what he was doing and how he was changing things and how he was just smashing records. A really beautiful example of the way in which you can innovate by having the audacity to try something new and really live with it, like push into it as hard as you can. So vision and innovation require inspired imagination. These are the things that you need to work with and need to consider when you're trying to sense into and create and build worlds that are different from what people expect. If our goal is to succeed, we need to be able to anticipate and react in a positive way to the impacts of emerging technologies. Being able to have a bit of foresight, to be able to sense into and understand all the possible ways in which an emerging technology can impact what it is that you do, whether it's a business, whether it's education, whether it's helping people sense into and see what could happen, the outcomes of technology, which are not always what we would refer to as positive. And the thing that design fiction does is it unlocks the connection between emerging technologies and human behaviors. And when you're able to create that connection and see it and sense into it, you're better able to anticipate the impacts that these emerging technologies might have on the world at large. So this is the insight. Design fiction unlocks that connection between imagination and innovation, between the things that we feel and the things that we create. So now let's get to design fiction itself. One way of thinking about design fiction is the creation of artifacts from possible near futures. The creation of artifacts from possible near futures. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, when I was a kid, I just loved this show. When you're a kid, you don't really have the language beyond, whoa, this is cool, to describe what it is about a show like Star Trek and what it makes you feel. For me, a lot had to do with like kind of gadgets and gizmos that they had on the show. It was very technological. And I was just coming into a kind of state of consciousness where I was learning about electronics, and I loved radios, and I would take things apart and all those kinds of things that you might imagine a 9-10-year-old boy growing up in a world in which consumer electronics were really becoming a thing would get into. And there was something about those things, about the nature of them as instruments, as devices, as things that they never really showed you much about them. But the storyline gave you a good sense of what their capabilities were. And their capabilities just seemed magical, but they weren't magical in a fantasy sense. They were magical in the sense of like the kinds of things that I was beginning to be surrounded by, radio sets, and like I was into ham radio and these kinds of things. They implied a trajectory towards devices like a tricorder, devices like the Star Trek communicator, and everything else. The communicator was a big deal for me. It was something that's like compact. It exuded all this kind of potential power of talking across a distance and all these things that a communicator and communications we know now makes people feel. It makes them feel connected. It makes them feel safe. It makes them feel like they've got this incredible power to access the world just from within their pocket and the palm of their hand. And while I was sort of fascinated by this stuff, I happened to come across this book. There's the Starfleet technical manual. I found it in my local hobby shop, which is the place I went to. You get your airplane models and model rockets and that kind of stuff. And they had this under glass in the case. And I took a look at it, and it's just like my mind was just kind of blown. Like, what is this thing? Here was this book that seemed to be a how-to of the objects that I was fascinated with from this show that I just thought was the coolest thing ever. And they showed it in such a way that it seemed like these things actually existed. I mean, why else would you have a technical manual with electrical schematics and enumerating parts if it didn't exist? There was just no making sense of it. You feel a sense of connection and imminent plausibility of this show that, I mean, I knew it was a fictional show. I didn't think it was a, documentary or something, but this did something extra special. It brought the show out of the box that was the television into the world. It just activated the imagination in such a way that at the time I had no language for. It was just like a feeling of plausibility that really, for me, honestly, it set a trajectory. I want to be the kind of person that creates things that need technical manuals like this. It just felt like it was closer to a future that I was enthralled by in the show of Star Trek. And so that was what I wanted to understand how to do. And ultimately understand how do you create the kind of effect that I felt as a young kid. And the guy who created that Star Trek Starfleet technical manual is this guy. His name is Franz Joseph. He was an aerospace engineer in Southern California, working, probably, designing airplane wings or fuselages or whatever he was doing. But he had a particular skill set and capability to mechanically draft and represent the work that they were doing as engineers, probably in places very much like this. And he just brought that to the Star Trek universe. So rather than drawing, wings for Northrop Grumman or Boeing or whoever, he decided that he was going to draw in the same style and technique and with the same level of sort of sincere plausibility the objects that he found in the Star Trek universe. And the interesting thing to note here is that he wasn't actually commissioned to do it. He just sort of did it on his own, which I think is quite interesting. And I look at Franz Joseph as a kind of archaeologist of the future. So we know that archaeologists, they dig around in the earth. They're looking for artifacts that represent worlds that once were. There's no one to talk to because these worlds are long gone, but they're looking for these objects, these little artifacts that are there and for which we try to find the story of the civilization, the culture, and all the dimensions that culture represents. What are the artifacts and how do they tell that story of that world? And that's what archaeologists do. And in some ways, I see Franz Joseph was doing something similar, only rather than looking for artifacts from the past, it was almost like he was traveling into the future, finding artifacts there and representing them as just these components of a larger world. And it's almost as if you can imagine that Star Trek Starfleet technical manual that we saw earlier, imagine that and there was no Star Trek show. What is the world that you would imagine just flipping through that it came from? How can you construct a story just through objects, just through artifacts, just through partial stories, components of a world, rather than the world told in the typical prose-based form, once upon a time, where you're given the whole lay of the land? All you have are, like a box of stuff that represents the world. And that very much is what design fiction does. And it's also interesting to note how, these worlds, again, we're talking about that movement from fiction to fact and, sometimes back again, sort of circulating. It's something else to consider in this context. For example, the humane AI pin. I mean, I'm not sure much I have to say about this, but to me, it's clear that there was someone who, was like, I love the idea of the communicator badge. Whether or not, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I wish it was done more often. I wish there were more direct lines drawn from these ideas. But clearly, in this case, I think, this is from Star Trek: The Next Generation, where their communications and their access to their computer that can answer questions for them and do all the stuff that we're anticipating AI today will do, is the embodiment. It's embodied in the idea and the hope and the dream of the humane AI pin, despite the fact that, it didn't do it very well. If it did it well at all, from all the reviews, doesn't mean that it's that the idea and the vision and the dream isn't compelling. It's just that recognizing that fact and fiction are always blurred in all these beautiful ways. So how do we unlock imagination and how do we innovate? And what is the design fiction process? So briefly, there are 4 steps: assess, synthesize, imagine, and then create. So assess is just kind of like observing the world, seeing what's going on in the world. It can be formally through trends and analysis. It can just be like sensitive and listening to the topics and the things that are on people's minds, listening to podcasts, listening to reading articles, and just sort of being abreast of what is going on. And that's a kind of assessment phase. What is going on in the world? And then the synthesis is just what exactly what synthesis means. It's just kind of like organizing, categorizing, trying to give a little bit more structure to the assessment, to the things that people are wondering about, the things that people are declaring, the work that's going on in the world, and organizing it in a fashion that kind of just clusters things in useful ways. And then you start imagining, what might this synthesis of things, if it were in some future, what might it look like? And here's where the imagination really needs to kick into gear, because you're imagining these things not from the top down, but as an archaeologist. What is the thing that the synthesis and the assessment might become if it were an artifact that existed in the world, that someone in some point in time dug out of the ground? What might it become? And one of the important things here is not to be declarative, not to say what it will be, but what might it be. So let's say we were looking at futures of food, right? And we assessed some sort of trends in that area. We looked at what it might be. One of the trends might be that there are new sources of protein, and there might be insect protein. Now, how might we represent that? How might we imagine what the future of food might look like if one of the major trends was insect protein? Well, we might imagine that an artifact in the form of a box of breakfast cereal. And that breakfast cereal might be proudly celebrating that the protein in it is actually derived from crickets. And there might be a flour that is cricket-based. And so rather than declaring that cricket-based flour will be a primary ingredient, which you couldn't really, that's not something that you dig up. That is a piece of information that you might not dig up. You would have to indirectly refer to that by making this box of cereal. And in that box of cereal, we might represent all the different aspects of the way in which culture has evolved, the means of manufacturing, sites of manufacturing, of course, the ingredients, the way the ingredients are determined to their quality and to the quantity of the ingredient. Where the crickets come from? Maybe probably places with better crickets than others. And so these are the things where the imagination really needs to push into, and not become too overly concerned with what is right or wrong. It's more of creating that sense of, okay, I see something has changed in the world, and this is the artifact that represents that change. Another way in which you might do it, one of my favorite ways, is to create a catalog of stuff from a possible future. And so we did this with TBD Catalog, which was done, I think it was 2014. I might have the year wrong. What we did is we asked ourselves, what might the future look like represented through products that you might find in an eclectic, expansive product catalog that's just filled with stuff. So imagine, I don't know, Alibaba or Amazon, but it's in a printed catalog. And so the assessment and the synthesis is just a group of people sort of discussing and describing what trends they saw in certain categories and how those trends might sort of cluster and work themselves into certain kinds of products, and how they would kind of represent and express these trends, but not as a trend in itself, but as something that you would find if you dug it up in the ground. And then we started imagining what these kinds of products might be. And so we add a little bit more resolution to some of the ideas by starting to draw out, like, okay, well, maybe this is like an armband, or maybe this is a pair of pants, or maybe this is something that you put into a television set, whatever it might be. We started creating these products, and we start thinking about and describing and discussing and adding sort of more detail to the products. What's in its name? Who makes it? How much does it cost? How do you get it? How many are made? What are they made from? Are these just things that are made in factories, or are they made more DIY, people make at home? Are they just things that you transact at with currency, or do you barter and trade? Like, what has happened in the world that we can represent, not as a list of trends, but as a list of products that are representations or implications of those trends? You begin to create a little bit more detail to them. So the thing starts actually looking like, wait, what's going on here? What are these things? This looks real. Continue to refine it and make it feel like it's something that you would actually find, that if you saw while you're waiting at your dentist's office, you might pick it up and wonder, what is this? What's going on here? And then, of course, the final level of resolution is like something that actually looks like a proper product catalog. This is the thing that you would dig up as an archaeologist. You would find this catalog. You might even find some of the products and begin to wonder more about the world. You would sense into the world. These artifacts tell you stories that you have to kind of feel into as part of the world. Here's a product that represents what AI might be like in the world. You might get these cards that you can pick up at your local convenience store that has, better or worse AI-based legal advice that you might pick up if you have a legal situation you need to deal with. I sort of imagine this being something that you could get at a vending machine in a courthouse if you want to argue your way out of a parking ticket or some other kind of misdemeanor, and you would explain to it the situation, and it would give you sort of advice and tell you what to say, and it might even say it for you. And some of them aren't so great. They different reputations and abilities, different ways of structuring and assessing the knowledge base. Maybe some of the knowledge doesn't come from the best of sources. And so you can imagine that this is the kind of world that might exist, and this is a representation of the implications of that kind of world. Okay, so that concludes the Design Fiction 101. Now let's talk about your brief for your design exercise during this Vision Week. Okay, let's mention the brief for your Vision Week design sprint. We would like you to imagine a possible future through a podcast that has come from that world. Imagine that we're in some near future world. Things have changed based on the emerging trends, themes, and technologies of today. Perhaps AI is now as normal, ordinary, and everyday as televisions we talk to, bottled water, and wheels on luggage. It feels a bit like today, in fact, but something is a bit off. Something is slightly different. It's not something like teleportation or shuttle service to Mars. Something at the vanguard of today has now become ordinary and everyday. If we listen to a sports news podcast, how might have AI changed the way sports are played? If we listen to a music review podcast, how has the way music is made, distributed, listened to, discussed, changed? If we listen to a financial news podcast, how has blockchain shaped what money is, how it is managed and circulated? What is work and value creation? How does value become money in this near future world? So this is your brief. Create an audio podcast from some possible near future. Consider topics that are relevant to you and of the moment. Futures of work, futures of sports, futures of money, futures of entertainment, futures of education. Think of the implications that today's emerging technologies like AI might have in these cultural sectors. You can pick your own podcast genre: news, sports, literature, finance, tech, game show, trivia show, an interview, etc. The podcast content should only imply that the world has changed. Avoid over-indexing on the technology. Avoid using specific dates, especially years. We're not trying to predict anything, nor are we trying to make it obvious that this podcast is entirely fictional. Think of the ways your favorite podcasts are produced, or listen to a popular podcast and identify the production elements. What is your theme song? Who are your sponsors and what are they selling? How many hosts are there? How long are the segments? Some practicalities. It helps to script yourself, record your rehearsals, and listen back to yourself. 11 Labs is a wellspring of tools for doing voice synthesis. Descript, the program, can help immensely with recording and editing. It allows you to edit by manipulating the transcript of your recordings. The outcomes: we want a podcast in MP3 format, as long as it needs to be, but no less than 10 minutes and definitely no longer than 30 minutes. A trailer for the podcast in MP3 format of no more than 30 seconds in length. And cover art for the podcast with a square aspect ratio, 1:1, that includes the names of your show and host names included. There should be a text description of the podcast, as you might see for any real podcast. Okay, that's it. I'll be around in the Slack channel for questions and to chat. Good luck. Have fun. I'm looking forward to listening to your futures.